First, a little bit of housekeeping for the channel. We crossed the 1,000 subscriber mark as of last week. And I mean, that's without even really trying very hard. This whole channel has really just been an experiment for me, where I decided that I was going to take the things that I had learned about science fiction and fantasy while writing it, lessons picked up along the way, and convey them to people who I thought would also be interested in them. And there's been quite a few people interested in them, and the feedback that I've been getting has been just wonderful. There are a lot of really curious and bright minds signing on and leaving comments and giving me great feedback all along the way. So thank you to all of you, and I hope to keep doing this for a good long time to come. And that brings me to today's topic, which is me talking about another of the big science fiction or fantasy influences in my life and how I tried to get out from under their shadow. And this is one that I think almost everyone who has encountered science fiction in some form has also encountered. It's a staple. It's really hard to get away from. And I'm talking about Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey. What I'm not going to do when talking about it, however, I'm not going to do a plot summary. I'm not going to do a rundown of the themes and all the rest of that, because that's stuff that most anybody coming into this is probably already going to know. Better people than me have already done it. In fact, at one point, I did sit down and cover a lot of this material in a review that I wrote for a project that was originally going to be a quarterly independent magazine of science fiction and fantasy criticism. This project never got off the ground. My essay eventually reverted back to me, and I published it on my website, and I'm going to link it in the description down below so you can see for yourself if that's what you're curious about. But I want to talk about first is how I encountered it, what it meant to me, and how I tried to get past that. Now, 2001 came out in 1968. I was not born yet. I was born a few years later, and for a long time, I was not able to see the film at all. And so I ended up, as many kids did in my situation, settling. I read the novelization, which was written by Arthur C. Clarke in conjunction with the film's production. I saw tons of stills. I even read this whole special feature that had been commissioned about its special effects, all this other stuff. But I was not able to actually see the movie. And then in, I think, 1981 or something like that, there was going to be a revival showing of it in theaters near me. And I was really excited by this. My parents were excited too, because they loved the movie also. And they're like, oh yeah, you got to see this in a theater. That's the best way. This didn't come to pass. The whole thing was canceled. I don't remember the exact details. I was predictably bummed. And then a couple of years later, the local PBS outlet, and this was New York City, decided that they were going to screen the film on broadcast TV, and they were going to do something else really interesting. They were going to take the soundtrack to the film and broadcast it in stereo by way of a local classical music station. I think it was WNCN. And a lot of TVs did not have stereo playback at the time, so you would have to turn on your actual stereo to hear it. And what my dad did was, see, at the time we had this really tiny TV. We had like a 13-inch color TV that took forever to warm up, and it sat on this little roll-around card. And what my dad did is he went and got his boombox, which he normally used for listening to shortwave broadcasts. And he put the boombox down in front of the TV. Now, as it turned out, the broadcast was a double feature. They were showing two Kubrick films. The first was Dr. Strangelove, which I had also not seen and which I had also heard endlessly about. Seeing it that way was an experience unto itself. And then immediately afterwards, 2001. And even though I was watching it on a tiny, tiny little TV with these huge speakers, that was a life-changing experience. It was really intimidating when you're that young and you're seeing something that wild, even on that tiny a screen. And so later on, when we actually wound up getting a VCR, because we didn't have one at the time, and when we wound up, actually getting a cable TV connection, which again we didn't have at the time, I was able to re-experience the film. And I've purchased the film since then in just about every video format that's been offered. If you look over my shoulder, you can see the 4K and Blu-ray edition on the shelf there, and that's the one that I currently have. That's also the one that I watched most recently when I was writing the review that I'm going to link down in the description. And one of the things that hit me, and that's hit me over the years as I was watching it, is that the outsized reputation of the whole thing can be very difficult to grapple with, in the same way that the outsized reputation of anything that you encounter culturally when you're young and you're ambitious is also going to hit you. When you're a teenager or in your 20s and you're writing your first projects, And then you go see something like Star Wars, you go see something like 2001, you go see The Matrix, whatever, and you're kind of knocked over and you say, oh man, how can I possibly compete with those things? Because that's, to me, the unspoken part of the equation that everybody walks around with, that they feel on some level that they have to compete with those things or they just won't measure up. And I don't know how to put it to you any other way, but it's not true. The point is not to compete with any of this stuff. And it took me a long time to realize that the point of watching and studying and appreciating something like 2001 was not to compete with it, not to try and put one over it, not to try and top it, but to ask tough questions, to ask myself, why did they do things in a certain way with this thing? And what does that mean? Why did they choose this particular approach for the project? And if I'm going to do something, does it make sense for me to do the same things? Where does it make sense for me to take cues from this project, and where doesn't it make sense? Like, one of the really hallmark features of the movie, I think, is it has an almost documentarian approach. It's very detached. It's almost very static, very laid back, very glacial. And that's a Kubrick thing, of course, but in 2001, it's really at its peak. And a big part of that was because when they were conceiving the film, there was a great deal about it that was designed to make it like a documentary. There was a whole introductory segment where they interviewed various scientists talking about the possibility of alien life. That was eventually scrapped. There was a voiceover narration that explained a lot of things. That was also scrapped. Thank God they scrapped that for the end sequence, because explaining what was going on at the end of the film would have been like cutting the drum open to see what it makes go bang. That's just no fun anymore. The whole point of the movie is that they don't explain everything, and that you bring a certain amount of your own intelligence and curiosity to it, and that it will give you something to think about and something to bring your meaning to. So that's another thing that they were doing that is not necessarily universally exportable. It's not something everybody should be trying to do. It's appropriate for certain kinds of stories, for certain kinds of science fiction. And in other cases, it's not. It's not appropriate to look at something like 2001 or any piece of work really and say, this is how to do it. This is the best. This is the top of the heap. Because one of the disadvantages of that is that it teaches you, maybe not something you even notice at first, that everything winds up becoming stack ranked. There's this thing all the way at the top that's the best, and then there's stuff below it, and then there's where you are, which is down at the bottom somewhere. And it took me a long time to stop seeing things that way. It took me a long time to stop thinking about 2001 or Blade Runner or what have you as a peak or pinnacle, and rather to see them as elements in a spectrum going across, whether a single dimensional spectrum or an XY or an even XYZ, because I think that's the healthier way to look at it. And then you look at these things and you say, they're still good. They're still reached a level of timelessness that's always great to appreciate. But they are not necessarily what the absolute pinnacle of things has to be. They just have a lot of good ideas that are worth paying attention to, and that are worth thinking about how they could be applied in whatever it is that I'm going to do. Because for a long time after I watched 2001, and the same thing happened with Blade Runner, I was sitting there with one story after another going through my mind that recapitulated in one form or another the aesthetic of 2001, or the ideas of 2001, or the flavor of 2001. The hardest thing to get beyond was the temptation to take whatever was in there, any one of these elements, and copy them. And it's really hard to figure out for yourself where your real inspiration is going to begin and where your external inspirations are going to leave off. And so I had a challenge in that vein when my appreciation of 2001 evolved over the years. And I think one of the things that happens is that when you start developing your own tastes and your own critical faculties, you stop thinking about things, again, as this best to worst. You start thinking about them as things in a palette. And you start saying to yourself, there are things that I would take from 2001 that seem useful and informative, like the documentary approach. But how you do that is probably, the way that I would do that in a story would now probably have nothing to do with 2001. You could look at it and you might say to yourself, there could be any number of inspirations for that, including actual documentaries. That's the healthier way to look at it, is to say, okay, how can we take what's in there and then take it as far away from it as we can in our own direction, our own direction. And the other thing I found about that process is that it takes time. You know, when I first watched 2001, I was really young, and it took decades for me to get to a point where I didn't feel intimidated anymore, where I could say, yeah, it's just another movie. It's just another piece of science fiction. There's nothing about it that makes me necessarily feel like I have to compete with it. I'm doing my own thing now. I'm standing on my own two legs. There's one other thing I think is worth bringing up here, which is that I get the impression that a lot of people are afraid to be that sterner with the things that they love because they're afraid that they might fall out of love with it. My firm conviction is that if you are in love with something, if you really love something that was formative for you, you're not going to fall out of love with it just because you take a more critical stance. I don't love 2001 any the less for being able to see it that much more clearly and be able to say, yes, this works, but only in this highly limited context. Or, you know, this was the correct approach for that movie, but it's not something that I think can be used universally, and that's not a ding against it. Stuff like that. If you really love something, you're always going to find that your emotional connection to it is not something that you can sever with logic. You can't be talked out of your love for something. And to my mind, that means that you should try that much more to think as critically as you can about the things you love. Not to tear them down, but to turn them inside out and to say, this is why I love this, or I know that I love this despite this. And being honest with yourself about those things makes it that much easier to see what it is you're putting into your own work. You can be that much more honest with yourself about the fact that the reason something has been put into a work that you're creating is because you just like it, you just think it's cool. And if you're aware of that, then you can make it serve its purpose that much more precisely. But if you're putting it in for justifications, I'm putting this in because it was in one of these things that I loved, and you're using that as the justification alone, you're not really unpacking it as completely as you can, then you're going to have more trouble with it. I'm going to end this video, as I do with many of my other videos, with a recommendation. I want you to think about something that's a classic from your childhood, something that you're really attached to personally, something you watched when you were really young. It left this tremendous impression on you. And I want you to think about all the ways that you could take that thing apart as if you were dissecting a piece of work in a workshop. And I want you to think about your emotional connection to the thing as you're doing that. I want you to try and think about how doing that may not necessarily have the emotional reactions that you think it will. I know that after I sat down and thought about 2001 and not just worshipped it, I found myself in a very different place with it. I found myself being able to love it that much more because I could do justice to it in ways that really felt like they mattered. I could do justice to my feelings about it in ways that weren't just about copying the surface of it. And I think that's one of the most important things that you can take away from any inspiration that you have, is that you're not just looking at the surface. You're not just looking at the superficial elements. You're looking at what you're really responding to, and you're trying to make your own version of that out of the substance of your own life. And that for me was the tough lesson. I saw 2001 when I was very young, when I really didn't have very much experience in my life. And it took me decades to get experience, the kind of experience that I needed to be able to take the right lessons from the movie and apply them in ways that would allow me to do something truly personal, that were not just copies of what I had seen. And finally, if you haven't seen 2001: A Space Odyssey yet, take the time to have your own encounter with it. Don't think too much about what other people think of it. Think about what you think of it. By all means, do check out what other people have to say. There's some great books written. There's my own essay, again, linked in the description. But have your own experience with the film. Try to take away from it something that is truly yours, that isn't informed by somebody else's opinion. Figure out what you really think about the movie. And if you're inspired by it, think about where those inspirations are coming from and where you can take them, and how you can live up to them in ways that aren't just going to be about copying what you see. See what you think.